you, Mark, for that excellent introduction, and Lori for that introduction. And thank you for doing such a wonderful land acknowledgement. I just wanted to reiterate before we start that today I'm going to talk a lot about my journey to open education, and that journey is all sort of rooted in being a settler on this land, and it's inextricably linked to this land. So I'm really glad that we're taking the time to honor and recognize the land and its rich history. Okay. So first of all, it's a small room, and I kind of want to get to know you guys a little bit better. Can you just raise your hand if you would consider yourself to be an educator? Okay. And what about a learner? Okay. And can I just see, who's a librarian? Yes, okay. Faculty member, instructional designers. No, it's okay. Yeah, students, sending students, grad students, cool. Students. Okay, so I just like to know who I'm talking to. I like to think of myself as both an educator and a learner. As you all probably guessed by looking at me, I'm pretty early career. I'm still learning every day, but I get to stand here in front of you and kick off this event, and I have OER in my job title, which is cool. So I have to, at the very least, give you some new information about open education, and hopefully you'll leave a little bit inspired, at least. And today, that makes me an educator. So I stumbled into open education work. I was an undergraduate student studying English, and I was supporting myself by shelving books at Robarts Library at the University of Toronto. And I really loved the job because I got to listen to audiobooks all the time. And I would do these 8-hour shelving shifts and just listen to like Tina Fey read Bossy Pants, and it was awesome. And every once in a while, I got to also find like a really funny book title. So this is a real photo that I took on one of my shelving shifts of a book called Evil, A Guide for the Perplexed, which I'm sure is very interesting. And unlike, I had a couple other jobs, unlike my second job where I worked at a telefund, I didn't talk to a lot of angry people at the library. And unlike my third job where I was a barista at a Teavana, I did not burn myself very frequently. So overall, it was pretty good. So like many humanities undergraduates nearing their time at the end of the university, I really did not know what I was going to do next. But I loved working in the library. It was really chill. So I applied to graduate schools to get my Master of Information degree, or to go to library school. And as luck would have it, around this time, copyright law in Canada was changing so much. And U of T Libraries was hiring for a scholarly communications and copyright office. And one of the first projects that office wanted to do was called the Zero to Low Cost Course Pilot Project, or ZTLCCPP, which is an intense acronym. And they wanted to exercise the new expanded copyright fair dealing guidelines by replacing course packs with library licensed material. And one of the things they needed to do for that was scan a ton of book chapters, which they had to retrieve from the library stacks. So I knew those stacks really well. So I felt like I was a really good fit for that job. And I decided to take the department head scholarly communications course, so it would be really hard for him to say no to me. And it was. So I started that job in November, which is like the peak time for getting course materials ready for the winter term. And when that busy time was over in about mid-January, we, as a team, started to work to calculate how much money we had spent, but also how much money we had saved. In that term, we saved students over $107,000 in just 12 courses. And they even let me talk about it at a conference, which was awesome. So I was an extremely privileged student. I want to say that. I had significant financial support from my family. But I also worked 3 jobs. I had a ton of student debt because even though I look Canadian, I'm American, and I was paying international student fees. And I had a huge pile of expensive textbooks under my bed because I did not know what I wanted to do with my life, and I tried a lot of different majors and changed classes a lot of different times. So I had finally found something that felt really good, and I felt really excited about it, and that was saving students money. So it didn't go take too long to go from thinking about saving money through electronic reserves to thinking that there must be other ways to save students money on course resources. I actually felt that our project catered really unfairly to upper year social sciences and humanities courses, which is not something you hear a lot, but that obviously fundamental science and fundamental math texts were incredibly expensive. And I knew that because I had a $200 introduction to psychology book that was just kind of sitting under my bed because the bookstore wouldn't buy it back. And I had taken it to fulfill a science requirement, and I was never going to touch it again. So I did some Googling, a few quick Google searches of free textbook science and free textbook psychology landed me on this OpenStack's psychology book, which was a complete textbook. To my untrained eye, looked very similar to that book that I had paid a lot of money for. It was customizable, it said. It was remixable. You could even print a copy of it, and they were calling it an open textbook. So very novel. This Introduction to Psychology course that I had taken had assigned that $200 book. There were 1,500 students in that class. It was taught in Convocation Hall, which is the largest space on University of Toronto's campus. And it was half of a year, so it was offered twice a year. And I had some math skills, and replacing that textbook with an open textbook meant $600,000 of savings. Yeah, so that's how I found open education. And I was aware of Spark because the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, because as part of my graduate assistantship, I also managed like hyperlinks on the Scholarly Communications Office website, and it was 2014, so the Spark author addendum was super in vogue at the time, and we had a bunch of links that were pointing over to Spark's website, and I knew they worked with open, so I found their definition of open education. Open education encompasses resources, tools, and practices that are free of legal, financial, and technical barriers and can be fully used, shared, and adapted in the digital environment. Open education maximizes the power of the internet to make education more affordable, accessible, and effective. That sounds pretty great, right? And then I found some other foundational stuff. David Wiley's 5 R's. With an open textbook, you can retain your book. Awesome, that sounded great to me. I couldn't count the number of PDFs of scanned chapters that I never downloaded from our learning management system and I really wished I had access to later on. Reuse the content. To me, I thought, it seems kind of silly to have that there. Of course you want to be able to reuse your content. Revise it. That sounds good. No professor using an open textbook would ever say, hey, skip this chapter. I don't like the way this person explains this. They would just take it out of the text. Great. Remix. Awesome. Sounded like e-reserves to me. Didn't really understand it. And redistribute. Great. Never would I have to worry about sharing a copy with a friend in my class or for me, because I was kind of a nerd, emailing my parents a copy of an article that I had read that I thought was really fun. So I thought, great, I'll become a scholarly communications librarian. I'll be an open education advocate. This sounds awesome. And I graduated and I packed up my Toronto apartment and I headed south to the US to North Carolina State University to become a copyright and digital scholarship librarian. So I had a lot of support in this role to pursue open education work. I was extraordinarily lucky to have the support of a department head and a leadership team that had been prioritizing open work for years. And I had the luxury of being in a fellowship, which meant that even though it was a precarious role and a time-limited role, I had a lot of special privileges kind of thrown at me, like extra professional development funding, and also a big spotlight on any projects that I wanted to do. And part of the reason why I wanted to go to North Carolina State is because they had already established an open education program, the Alt Textbook Project. This was a project to distribute small amounts of funding to faculty to replace commercial resources with free resources. And it had had sustainable funding for about 3 years, since 2013. And it was well on its way to saving students $500,000. It was also, when I was doing my research, one of the first of its kind in North America. So I felt really excited to get to go down there and work on it. And in an incredible twist of fate, about a month in, my supervisor told me he was going to have his first child and he was going to go on paternity leave, which left me the de facto director of the Copyright and Digital Scholarship Center and its sole employee. And it also left me in charge of this alt textbook project. So I had to learn really quickly. I learned because I had to. I learned because I was hungry. So American copyright law, okay, no problem. Expertise on Creative Commons licensing, I was kind of familiar with that. I would do a lot of reading. And then there was a lot of pressure to do projects, so I applied for and received a national grant for work on OER development for psychology. I even went to Capitol Hill with Spark, this is me at Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina's office, to advocate for open education and open access about a week after the 2016 US presidential elections, which was a very interesting vibe on Capitol Hill. I think I reached like this sort of peak kind of empowerment that November. I was basically working in this super heavily resourced silo. And every time I poked my head out to be like, hi, I'm here, people were like, great, have some more resources, which is an amazing problem to have. But I was also working 60 hours a week. I was completely burnt out, and I had little critique or constructive feedback. I started to become really separated from the impact of that work, and I frankly wasn't sure why I was doing what I was doing, why it was important to me, or why it should be important to anyone else. And I was thinking a lot about the happy accidents that had led me to that point. And I would say things to my partner like, well, I never would have gone to that information session on this fellowship if they weren't giving out pizza. So basically, I only have this job because I love pizza. Or I would go even further back. I never would have gone to library school if I hadn't worked at the library. And I only liked working at the library because I really didn't want to talk to anyone. So it's only because I don't like people. And then even further back, I never would have worked in the library if my roommate hadn't gotten that job and said, you're wasting so much time at this telefund, I'm going to put in a good word for you. They never would have seen my resume. It started to feel like maybe this was not something I was passionate about, but I was failing up on the path of least resistance. So I decided I should try something else. And I went to another library, Western Libraries, and I took a job as a liaison librarian with subject responsibility for management studies, which is something I had no experience in. And I was really excited. I was like, I'm going to just be a librarian, like the typical kind of librarian. It's going to be awesome. But everything that I had felt failing up at North Carolina, I felt it tenfold as a liaison because I didn't have anything familiar to me. I was looking for something, open education or otherwise, that I could sort of sink my teeth into, and I could not find it. The culture shock left me feeling paralyzed, and I knew I wanted to do something else and be somewhere else, but I didn't know where or when, and it made me feel like I didn't know who I was at all. So that's my origin story, and every good keynote needs an origin story, but 2 for 1 today. I'm going to give you a second origin story, going above and beyond. I'm going to tell you a story about Rose. So I recently learned that Gertrude Stein wrote one children's book, which is interesting. It was published in 1939, and it was called The World is Round, and it's pretty much exactly what you would expect from a children's book written by Gertrude Stein. And if you can't expect anything, you'll find out. The World is Round is the story of a 9, almost 10-year-old little girl named Rose, who is, of course, as 9, almost 10-year-olds are, dealing with a lot of existential angst. And she's having a ton of anxiety and dread because she doesn't know if she would be Rose if her name were not Rose. And she cries and she sings to herself this little song of questions. She asks, why am I a little girl? And when am I a little girl? And where am I a little girl? And which little girl am I? So simply, Rose is having a little identity crisis. And when I learned about this book, I felt this instant connection to this little girl. She reminded me of this emptiness and gnawing detachment that I had felt in my first couple of jobs after that newness and shine and excitement had worn off. Her questions and her journey to answer them felt really strangely parallel to my own journey to tease apart these giant concepts of open education, open access, librarianship, and to understand who I was and who I wanted to be. But it's not just me that can learn from Gertrude Stein's Rose. There's something we can all learn from these questions. As open education starts to take off in places like Brock and Ontario and Canada and North America, we see these large chunks of work being done by educators and scholars and students being sort of dragged under this umbrella that we're calling the open education movement, or as some people like to call it, the movement. And it's a big bucket of stuff. And there's something really awesome in these formative years of growing something about being able to point and say, hey, that thing that I'm doing that I don't know what it's called, that's called open education work. Or did you know that you are doing open pedagogy or OER? This is the movement. And to get that traction, we have to feel inspired. We have to feel like we are a part of something. We have to feel like that something is doing good. But slowly, we have started to use the word open as synonymous with good. What would happen to open education if all of a sudden its greatest advocates could not use the word open to describe themselves? I taught this course this summer, and on the second to last day of the class, myself and my fellow instructors asked the class to name the values that open makes possible. In other words, why are you an open education advocate? There was, of course, a lot of overlap, a lot of sharing and access and affordability, but there were also some words that came out of this exercise that I never in a million years would have listed as a reason I support open education. For example, someone wrote sustainability. And there were also things that were really important to me that didn't make an appearance the way that I thought they would, like agency and equity. When open means everything to everyone, we start to lose touch with the heart of it, and it begins to mean nothing at all. So over the past few years working in open education, I've been to a ton of events like this, talks, workshops, and most of these events have the same kind of rhetoric. Open education is going to change the world, and we are going to make education about everyone, everywhere, having access to better education, and all that we, the participants, need to do to create a better and more open and equitable and amazing education system is just master this 30-second elevator pitch. And we have to be just prepared to rebut any criticism, and we need to memorize all of these facts. Like 39% is the average rate of food insecurity for post-secondary students, according to a study of 5 major Canadian universities. Or 65% of students in a multi-institution survey said that they had elected to not buy a textbook. Or open ed is great because 93% of students using OER perform as well or better. Open education is the solution to our problem, which is our system of education. And there is nothing wrong with that sales pitch, and there is definitely nothing wrong with that research and those facts. But that pitch is strengthened by a personal connection, by knowing how and why and for whom do you support OER, and how will this influence your practice. Now, the final product of this course was a statement of personal values for OER work. Much like a teaching philosophy, this statement served as a touchstone when starting projects, or when advocating for open, or when feeling lost in the middle. You all have different reasons for coming here today, different connections to open education, whether or not you've fully grasped that connection yet. But wherever you are, wherever you're coming from, I want you to take a few moments to think about the things that you hope that open will allow you to accomplish as an educator and as a learner, and why those things are important to you. Maybe you can name hundreds of things, or maybe there's just one thing that brought you here today. Maybe you're just curious, but keep that in the back of your mind as we take a deeper dive into open education and start to unpack those principles that are at the basis of open ed. Technology, the power of the internet. Technology and the power of the internet are deeply baked into Spark's definition of open education. Open education works because of the internet. So who has access to the internet? Who has access to technology? Now, I'm sure you have all heard the term digital native. It was first coined in 2001 by Mark Prensky, who is a self-described practical visionary, which is interesting. According to Mark's website, his background includes teaching at all levels, elementary through college, and he's also been a professional musician and a Broadway actor. So he's basically the ultimate Renaissance man. And in 2001, Mark wrote this phrase in an article that coined this term. Today's students, K through college, represent the first generations to grow up with new technology. They spent their entire lives surrounded by and using computers and video games, digital music players, video cams, it's interesting, cell phones, and all the other toys and tools of the digital age. The most useful designation I have found for them is digital natives. Our students today are all native speakers of the digital language of computers, video games, and the internet, with a capital I, because it's 2001. This term has been heavily criticized, though. Within a few years, critics of Mark's term and the people who accepted the digital digital native, digital immigrant binary were out in full force. In fact, in 2007, Urban Dictionary author, song poet, succinctly defined digital nativism as the mistaken belief that young folks who were born immersed in things digital are somehow in a state of grace, and older folks are cursed by their age and lack of digital conditioning, an arrogant and insulting division of generations into different camps first proposed by Mark Prensky, but unfounded on any survey data. But Mark's not just creating this false binary between generations of students when it comes to technology. He's also making huge assumptions about the experience of growing up in a world where home computing and home internet simply exist. What Mark is doing by creating this false homogeneity of a generation is failing to recognize the difference between their experience and their lived experience. The term lived experience has evolved from an emphasis on taking into account not only the visible or categorical characteristics of someone, but also the invisible factors that influence their daily life. So, for example, a student's experience might be represented as, I'm taking an introductory psychology course and I'm not performing well. But their lived experience is probably more complex. Like, I'm taking an introductory psychology course, but the latest edition of the book was too expensive, so I bought an old edition, and also the professor assigned a lot of videos, but I only have one computer at home, and my sister needs it to do her homework too, so sometimes I can't watch them before class, and my marks are suffering. Dr. Donna Lankloss, who is an anthropologist at UNC Charlotte Libraries, writes that experience is a neat thing that we can think we know the meaning of, but as soon as you start talking about lived experience, things get messy. And Donna, in her research, tries to make sense of the messiness of lived experience, because only by beginning to understand this real world can you begin to design a better student experience. So this is a cognitive map that was drawn by a postgraduate student at University College London who is a participant in one of Dr. Lankloss's research studies. And this student is mapping all of the places where she learns. This technique is a large component of Dr. Lankloss's research. She asks students to change the colors of their pen every 2 minutes, and they draw for 6 minutes. So blue is the sort of first round of drawing, green is the second, and red is the last minute add-ons. And then the student explains the map to their researcher. And in this body of maps that she's collected, she has gotten maps that cross state lines, sometimes even oceans. Learning spaces include institutional, residential, commercial, and public spaces. This student's map is particularly interesting to me because it includes public transportation, which was a recurring theme for students in urban environments. And the fact that your students are studying in coffee shops or on the bus is not alarming in and of itself. Each of you probably walks around downtown St. Catharines or campus and you see students on laptops or huddled around textbooks. It's not a surprise that our students are part of a larger world. And it's not a surprise that they use the space in that world to do their academic work. But what happens when we bring that to the forefront of our consciousness? And how can you choose, for example, course materials that are not just open, but that are accessible in any learning space? And can open education even accomplish that? Big questions. Now, let's zoom in on the devices that the students are using. There's a great study published by Maura Smale and Mariana Regalado in 2014. That's a qualitative study of undergraduates at colleges in the City University of New York CUNY system. And it's trying to unpack how, where, and when students accomplish academic work and how access to technology or lack of access to technology impacts that. While most of the subjects of the studies have some kind of access to internet-enabled technology outside of school, and the overwhelming number of students would be probably considered by Mark Prensky to be these digital natives, access to technology was still an enormous source of frustration for students. Having access to an off-campus computing device did not mean that they had unrestricted access to that off-campus computing device. In addition to sharing devices with parents, roommates, and siblings, students mentioned having limited data, limited bandwidth, or limited battery life. They talked about struggling to get access to a computer or even an outlet to charge their own device on campus. And others with personal laptops were either concerned about the security of that laptop or just the weight of the laptop and a bag full of books, and they elected to not bring personal devices to campus. In addition, the average commute for a student was between 45 and 60 minutes each way, and a lot of students relied on cell phones to do schoolwork during their commute. More than one student in the study mentioned using their cell phone, like this kind of a cell phone, to type out essays. Yeah, I can't even text without a typo, so I don't know how you could write like a 2,000-word essay, but a lot of professors confirmed that they received a lot of sent from my BlackBerry, sent from my iPhone essays from students, because necessity is the mother of invention, and these students were really determined to find a way to succeed in their education. So ultimately, the study finds that for the most part, students are using personal devices for academic purposes, but that there's this sort of strategic and interesting way that students are using these devices. And for many students, economic constraints still have a huge impact on their ability to do their academic work on and off campus. For students who experience real struggles because of financial constraints, replacing a heavy and expensive textbook with a free and open digital resource may alleviate some of the stress, but sometimes it disproportionately benefits students who don't have the same economic burdens. The student who can afford on-campus housing, a new laptop, unlimited data, high-speed internet, that student is more poised to take advantage of a high-quality, high-tech digital resource than the student without. So returning to our definition, how can we say that open education maximizes the power of the internet to make education more affordable and accessible when access to the internet is not a given or a constant, and when there are different levels of internet access and privilege? Now, of course, if we're going to take into account lived experience of students, we have to take into account the lived experience of the people that have to implement this open education work, the instructors. So consider the flip side of that student experience. For an instructor, their experience might be represented as, I teach an introductory psychology course, but the lived experience that student was struggling with that text so much might look something like, I teach an introductory psychology course. I was hired on a contract a few weeks before the semester started, and I used the old text, which was, by the way, authored by my department head, and I also used the syllabus. So I wanted to show a little initiative, and I tried to give the class my own personal touch by assigning some of my favorite YouTube videos to explain the lectures and supplement the text. There are serious constraints on anyone's ability to implement open educational resources or pedagogies in their classroom. I want to say you are all incredibly lucky here at Brock. You have some amazing supports. You've got Jennifer and Lori and Julia, and later today you'll get to hear from instructors that have already been working with open educational resources or open pedagogy, who are models for what it looks like to engage in this kind of open work at Brock. But that's exactly what it is. It is work. And I think when you hear all of your peers speak later today, you'll probably see bits and pieces of what you all are doing or of information that you're already really familiar with. Maybe you've been doing OER work all along and you just haven't had a word for it. But if you're not there yet, it can be difficult to make space to fit OER in. First of all, you each have a unique workload balance or distribution of effort. Service work, research, teaching, it's all distributed differently. And all of that plays into your evaluation, especially if you're a pre-tenure or contract role. And so I've been to a lot of open education events, and I've been very well trained to argue that OER work is teaching. Open education is teaching, and it's pedagogical innovation because OER allows you to remix and revise resources, and it gives you this newfound pedagogical flexibility that you've never had with a traditional textbook. So if you take all of those permissions to the next level, you actually engage students in creation of resources, and creating an OER and reworking a syllabus around open textbooks should be evaluated as teaching. But at the same time, all of that extra behind-the-scenes work takes a lot of time. Maybe it would even require course release. Maybe taking an instructor out of the classroom is not in the game plan or the budget for the department this year. So you can't argue that it's teaching. So no problem, we can argue that it's research, right? Research or scholarship, creating something new information, new published work. That's a new textbook, new OER. But textbooks don't have that same kind of like peer review, journal impact factor shine that maybe is valued by a tenure committee. And it's really hard to write a textbook. It's a lot longer than a typical research article. And if you don't have time to do both in your pre-tenure, you might have to focus on that journal publication. And you could probably argue that OER work is service to the field because it takes it makes public and free, accessible information in your domain, and maybe you're even like creating the seminal text for your discipline. That would be really cool. You're replacing that really expensive book with a new seminal, free, open book. That is rare, though, and you have an OER committee here at Brock, but maybe you won't end up on an OER committee, and there are lots of committees that you could serve on that would maybe be a good use of your service time. And if you're not a subject matter expert, you're a librarian or you're an instructional designer, you're in a really great OER support role. There's a huge place for you in OER work if you're an instructional designer. If you're a librarian, I can talk to you about all the ways you can pitch OER as part of your job. But is there a space for OER in your workload? Open education work is happening off the side of the desks of super keen and super excited educators who have the luxury of this spare time and this support. Now, I think many of you here are uniquely positioned to be successful as open educators and open advocates. As Mark mentioned earlier, we are at an institution that has incredible support for new and interesting pedagogy and has devoted time to this Open Education Day 2 years in a row. You have people in this room who have depth of understanding about open education that many institutions just don't have. And you have a provincial institution, eCampus Ontario, that has been funding this work. So compared to most places at this macro level, you are really poised to be successful. But you each also operate within your own microcosm of your discipline, your faculty, your department, your institution. Organizational culture in academia is layered and complex and often in conflict with itself. Often conventions and policies that may be frustrating and confusing to one person are a comfort to others. And roadblocks can pop up in unexpected places, and rerouting can be tricky. Expectations could be communicated inconsistently or not formally recorded at all. In my last librarian job, for example, there were all of these unwritten rules about space. We had these walls on our offices that went all the way to a foot below the ceiling, and then they stopped. So you could hear basically everything happening in other offices, but you couldn't see anyone. And then there was this communal staff lounge that no one had the key code for and no one used. So no one went to there. So there was also a large communal shared table, and I never saw anyone sitting at that. And then in our offices, we each had at least one, if not two, extra chairs, and we had phones. So I thought, okay, I can take a meeting or a phone call in the office, or if it's too many people, I can do it at that large communal table. And this was for sure not the case. It turned out that the offices and lack of soundproofing had been a controversial issue in the department dating back nearly a decade. And if you took a phone call or you had a chat with someone, inevitably another person would knock on your door 10 minutes later and say, you know, I'm really trying to work. It's really distracting to have meetings in your office. And this lack of understanding of these unwritten and unspoken rules about space positioned me poorly to create relationships with my colleagues. And that's all because of a wall that was just 1 foot too short. And that's just a little insignificant piece of organizational context. So just as you know your personal values better than anyone else, you probably have the best understanding of your unique position within your ecosystem. And you probably also have the best understanding of the boundaries of what you know and what you do not know. And that deep understanding, that's your superpower to start open ed work. So let's return to Rose. In her search for clarity, she decides to climb a mountain. Rose was super ahead of her time. She's basically the poster child for millennial self-discovery. Thanks, Rose. And by putting herself in a brand new territory, it forced her to face these things that were unknown to her, new smells and sounds and creatures. She learns that even though a mountain looks blue from far away, it's actually really green up close, so that's interesting. She makes it through the night, and she talks herself out of being scared of a spider that may or may not be there. And she even has a confrontation with an otter, which she learns is a very vicious creature. And she emerges not quite at the summit of the mountain, but she has this greater understanding of why and when and where she is a little girl and which little girl she is. But she also emerges with a new sense of comfort in not knowing. She can now ask herself these questions, and she's not crying, so step up. And she knows that she's going to be exploring these questions for a really long time. She feels confident in her identity as Rose, while she feels confident continuing to explore that identity. And so Rose, who is a 9, almost 10-year-old girl, lest we forget, whips out a penknife, okay, and carves into a tree. This is all not recommended in 2019. Rose is a rose is a rose. In July of 2018, I had pulled myself out of my last library job, and I had just started this position at eCampus Ontario, where I started as a program coordinator, and I left behind a tenure-track librarian job. And I felt so lucky when I had that librarian position because it was stable, and it was something that people really want when they're in library school. And I felt so guilty to not have loved it and to have wanted to leave so desperately. And also, there was a new government in Ontario, and they had new priorities, and everyone was saying, we don't know what's going to happen. And I was so scared, but I was also really excited, and I was venturing into this new territory. And to ground myself, I thought about all of the reasons that I was interested in open education and why I had taken this job. And I wrote the following statement of personal values about why I do open education work. I facilitate equitable access to knowledge inside and outside of the academy. I value all people as consumers and creators of knowledge, regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, education, ability, or status. And I support open education work as a way to lower the technical and financial barriers to post-secondary education. I strive to create opportunities for my community to engage with OER and open practices and to claim their right to be lifelong participants in the information ecosystem. Now, I did not write anything of this sort in 2014 when I first kind of stumbled into this world, but I imagine it would have been really different. Something like, I advocate for free and digital educational resources to reduce the cost of education for students, to make education better for everyone. Because 5 years ago, I had no knowledge of open pedagogy. The people I look up to, people who are my role models in open education, they weren't even on my radar. I had never heard of them. Through this work, I have met so many colleagues, and they have become my closest friends. They challenge me, and they teach me things, and they make me think about the way that our world works in a totally different way. My world has grown and has changed, and it's expanded in so many ways that since I discovered open education. And it's going to continue to grow and change in ways I can't even imagine. The unknown that used to be so frightening is now really exciting. So today, I'm the digital access and OER lead at eCampus Ontario. My context changed again. There was a gap in our organization, and I sort of threw my name in. I said, I want to try doing this. And I moved into this role working on our systems that facilitate creation of OER and access to OER across post-secondary education in the province. I now work on an IT team. That's new. I get to be around 3 people every day with really different perspectives, really different skill sets than I've ever worked with before. I have different resources at my disposal, more responsibility for change, and more liability for failure. And I'm constantly confronted with things that I don't know. So I try to bring as much of that value statement as I can. I try to consider it when I'm reviewing what the systems we use should be, when I make decisions about licensing and accessibility requirements, or when I try to just find a better way to facilitate access to one of our tools. But the deeper I get into this position, and it's only been like 3 months, the more I think it's time for me to revise that statement. Because new things are popping up every day. So 2 weeks ago, I traveled to Ottawa to do bilingual testing of our new open library. And while I was booking my flight, I started to have a little bit of a panic attack because our library exists in French, but it doesn't really work in French. We only have 6 French textbooks, and I had just added one of them that day. That's 2% of the resources in our library. And those 6 resources, they all have English descriptive information, English keywords and English subjects. They have French titles, and some of them have French abstracts. But essentially, you weren't going to be able to find them. So how could we possibly test this library with our French-speaking users? Now, I had a conceptual understanding before this about the language bias in open education. There's an awesome analysis of OER repositories that I read, published in 2017, and I am very prone to citing 89% of OER repositories are hosted in Europe or North America. Good fact. Most open education conferences or events are held in English. I'd seen calls for proposals for English-speaking OER conferences in Slovenia, South Africa, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Portugal, France. And in my travels, I have met people from all over the world, and I have basically exclusively communicated with them in English. English is the dominant language for open communication, open scholarly communication. But I could get on a plane and I can be at a classroom at La Cité, which is one of our institutions, and it's a French institution. And I can be surrounded by Francophones who are not comfortable in English. And I can do that in under 2 hours. And my statement of values that I've been using as a touchstone, it does not take into account the lived experience of these Franco-Ontarians. They had never been a part of my context. So I'm pretty sure it's time for me to ask again, why am I an open advocate? When am I an open advocate? Where am I an open advocate? And which type of open advocate am I? I am 26, almost 27 years old, and I have been working in open education for nearly 5 years. I have almost 40 years of a career left. I work at eCampus Ontario. We've only been advocating for open education for less than 5 years, and our initial mandate was just to create a home for Ontarians to find courses that they could take online. So we're at the beginning of our OER climb, and we have no idea what the rest of our mountain looks like. Now, I have some modest goals. In the next couple of months, I really want to work on our barriers to accessing tools to author OER by making it really easy for anyone to sign up for Pressbooks using their institutional ID. Great. This summer, I want to have an Ontario community of practice that's connected with creating, customizing, and using OER, and I'm in the middle of writing proposals and budgets and looking for venues to sort of kickstart this initiative. This year, I hope that we cross 100 reported adoptions of OER in Ontario, increasing from our 80 reported adoptions currently. I know that more people are using OER, and I want to find them, and I want to see that number climb. In 5 years, I hope to have built out that fully French library with as many resources as we have in our English library, and I want it to be backed by a strong community of Franco-Ontarian power users and creators. I want to unlock resources from our learning management systems, and I want to make people feel like it's okay and it's not scary to share what they make. And so, yes, I guess I am guilty of that open education movement rhetoric because, frankly, I do think we're here to disrupt a system, and I do think we are here to change the world. And this is the beginning of my journey, and I'm barely looking beyond the immediate horizon. So, whatever point you are at in your OER journey, please remind yourself of Rose's questions. Answer what you can, let the others be unanswered. Embrace the unknown and the messiness of your own lived experience and of the lived experience of people around you, and practice for your context, and you can make open work for you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here as an early career speaker, and I am so excited to see what happens at Brock in the future and in Ontario.